This video is sponsored by Into the AM. You can go to intotheam.com/TacticalTortoise to get 10% off all sorts of cool space-themed apparel, like this shirt. It's got an astronaut on it. That's pretty cool. More about them at the end of the intro. What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and we are deep into 10th edition, and I haven't done a Tyranid unit tier list for the new edition yet. But over the last couple weeks, I have put a ton of games in with Tyranids, and I feel like I have a pretty good lockdown on the good power rankings for Tyranid units in the 10th edition index. Now, at the time of recording, Tyranids are still within their index phase, and I know they are staring down the barrel of a codex relatively soon, so I don't know whether that will change where these units end up in that power level. As always, if you enjoy my Warhammer 40k content, please leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel, all the YouTube things, and just like our other tier list, we're going to be breaking down all these units to 5 categories. Today, I have selected the bad units. These ones are not very good, and you probably shouldn't be playing them. The not great units, they're fine, and you can put them in lists and probably do well with them, but there are better options elsewhere in the codex. The mediocre units, which are units that are still pretty important to the faction and fairly useful, but aren't necessarily central to the identity of Tyranid army. The staple units, which are incredibly good in Tyranid armies as support, and you'll find them pretty oftenly taken in the highest level of competitive events, and hard carry units, which are basically the backbone of the army, and you'll usually be taking at least one of these in most armies that you play.
Have you ever said to yourself, I wish that my sweatshirts had more vertical lines terminating in a falling spaceman? Basically, a question I ask myself waking up every single day. Into the AM has you covered.
This video is sponsored by Into the AM, the purveyors of all manner of graphic and high quality t-shirts and other clothing items for your shopping pleasure, including this little jellyfish guy. As you're upgrading your armies for Warhammer 40k 10th edition, you can also be upgrading your wardrobe when you go to tournaments so you can show off your style. They actually have a really hefty theme on spacemen and aliens, so they fit right at home with a sci-fi game like Warhammer 40,000.
Today we're wearing a sexy little spaceman. He's chilling with his monitors in his space station. Basically, he and I have the same lifestyle.
So you can peruse through their website and take a look at all of these super cool designs that they have available, and maybe your opponents will appreciate your style enough and be distracted by the colorfulness of your graphic t-shirt to take the pressure off a little bit, forget to score their secondary objectives, and lose the game.
This octopus. Look at him. What a cutie pie. Not you, Inky.
Or maybe they'll just be seduced by the high quality feel of the t-shirts or hoodies, and they'll be too busy trying to grab your biceps instead of actually rolling their dice, forcing them to clock out and have to forfeit their matches.
Unironically, I just put this shirt on to record this little segment and went, oh my god, this feels super good. It's actually kind of like silky smooth on the sleeves. Super sweet quality, at least on the hoodies. The t-shirts are pretty comfy as well.
So go check them out at intotheam.com/TacticalTortoise and send your wardrobe to the moon. So with that out of the way, let's dive in and discuss the Tyranid power ranking, starting with the bottom tier, the bad units. First off, we have the Spore Mines, the regular Spore Mine units, and Mucilid Spores. These guys typically find themselves at the bottom of the list simply because the datasheets are really not intended to be purchased for your army. These are units that you generate for free over the course of the game, either with Biovores or Sporocysts. In that capacity, they're phenomenal because you don't pay any points for them, but as a unit, I wouldn't add it to your army. Tyranids are in this tier as well because drop pod mechanics are actually not very good in 10th edition 40k. Not only can you not charge after disembarking from a Tyranid, but everything in the game can strategic reserve for free now, and with rapid ingress, the restrictions on the placement for strategic reserve, which are much easier than they were in 9th edition, allow you to jump in at the cost of CP rather than points. So instead of putting a big, huge, hard to hide monster on the table that your opponent can easily score bring it down on, you can just bring your guys off the side for free. And the biggest units that you would really want to deep strike onto central objectives like big monsters and stuff like that are too large to fit into Tyranids anyway, since you can only put up to 12 wounds of monsters inside it. Just kind of a big miss. Next up, we have the Hierophant Biotitan. This one's kind of hard to place. As always, the Hierophant has had tough time moving around tables, and I think that's still going to retain in 10th edition just because it's so physically massive that you're going to have a hard time putting it in many deployment zones, depending on how it's assembled and how large your Hierophant tends to be. And that style of unit is not one that I really appreciate in army. This guy's really big and cool and awesome, but as a single model, he's not really carrying the weight of the team on his back. The Sporocyst is mostly in this bad tier for the fact that it is an OC0 fortification. It doesn't really do much to actually secure you victory points, and which is largely, why you're playing utility units like this guy. He does have a cool reactive fire ability, and he does spawn mucilid spores. Either defend your objectives by killing enemies that go near them and perform actions themselves, but the Sporocyst has to take the turn off shooting in order to generate new spores. So it's basically just doing actions and things all by itself anyway, and the limitations on where you can place those mucilid spores are pretty tight. Ripper Swarms are another one sort of similar to the Spore Mines that are largely generated by other units and effects and aren't really intended to be played. Now, I do think that unlike Spore Mines, Ripper Swarms do have some stuff going for them. They have some cool special abilities and they can deep strike, but the downside of these little guys is that they are OC0. They're not holding objectives for you, so deep striking them into interesting places to do objectives, you could just fulfill that role with Spore Mines that you get from free for other units. If you are purchasing Ripper Swarms, you're most of the way to purchasing a Biovore who just gets you a bunch of individual model units for free, and you don't even have to pay for the Ripper Swarms. And being swarms rather than beasts or infantry means they can't go through walls, their movement's restricted, they can't hold objectives, and they just have a lot of fails. Moving on to the Wings Tyranid Prime, this guy is unfortunate because I liked his model from Leviathan, but as a character who gives up assassination, doesn't really do too much for his team, and on top of that, it's just sort of kind of pointless. He doesn't really attach to very good units, he doesn't have good buffs for those units, and he doesn't even punch very hard when he gets to swing. In fact, his only real melee effect lets him attack when he's killed, which is something you should try to have your models avoid if at all possible. This guy's just basically a big mess. He is cool in combat patrol, less so in the 2K game. Next up, we have Hive Guard. On the level of playability, Hive Guard aren't the worst thing ever. They can take a pretty cool indirect fire weapon that's extremely short ranged, or a pretty punchy anti-vehicle weapon, but both of them are low AP, so cover is going to impact them pretty deleteriously, and unless you kind of go through the convoluted hoops to ignore cover with them, they're most likely going to be bouncing off any sort of armor save at all. They also have a cool Overwatch ability, but generally speaking, you'd much rather be using your 1 per turn Overwatch on a large unit with blast weapons or a flamer that just has a higher volume than these guys. For their points cost, I'd leave them at home. Moving on to the next tier, we have the not great units. These ones, they're fine. They're certainly playable and they can fulfill roles in specific situations, but I would generally leave them for more efficient options elsewhere. Starting with the Tyranid Warriors, both ranged and melee, these guys have fallen quite far from their 9th edition incarnation. While melee warriors actually have a pretty sweet damage output, they have a lot of attacks with twin linked and melee, they're very slow. Ranged warriors compact with less melee prowess, but a ranged weapon that has a low ballistic skill, so you're not that excited about it anyway. They're a relatively expensive heavy infantry unit that's not survivable enough to survive like heavy infantry generally wants to be doing, and they don't have the attack profiles to be kind of an alpha strike unit. Not to mention that they're just move 6 idiots, so they're largely going to be out threat ranged by basically anything else in the game. These guys really don't have a role in the current codex, and I think that's unfortunate for them, something that I hope the new codex will repair. Next up, we have the aircraft profiles in Tyranids. These things are okay, but not that exciting. They do have the hover keyword, so they're able to forego their aircraft mechanics in order to deploy on the table, but what they're bringing to the table is not super sweet. They have a bunch of guns, but the gun weapon profiles for the cost of the model are not very effective. Venom cannons and Stranglethorn cannons are not particularly exciting ranged attacks to have. You're looking for something a little bit punchier, ideally at a higher volume. And unfortunately for the Harpy, which used to be a staple thanks to its ability to spawn Spore Mines, the Spore Mines now have to be placed in restrictive areas. I think largely it's the weapon profiles that kill them for me though, but neither of these things really pack quite a punch. Similarly, the Toxicrene is a big tanky boy, but at the points value he's currently at, he's just too expensive for what he does. Not to mention that this is a physically large and imposing model, which makes it hard to move around the table, hard to hide out of line of sight with, and although getting cover is easy, which is kind of nice, I guess, that doesn't really help him, especially if he's in a fight with something that isn't just a bunch of infantry. He does have some pretty good weapon profiles on his datasheet, but it's not really something you're looking for in Tyranid specifically, and he gets overshadowed by some of the other options that we'll discuss later. The Turvagon is the next one. These guys are relatively tough to kill with that big Tyrannifex chassis with a high save, wounds, and toughness characteristic, and they respawn Termagants back to their units, which is great. And I think these guys are pretty fringe playable in some situations, especially regenerating termagants onto your objectives in order to keep control of them. That said, I'm not 100% convinced quite yet that the termagant horde is the way of the future. I do think that there are going to be a lot of factions that are attacking to destroy hordes, especially with the popularity of genestealer cults right now, and killing your units of termagants wholesale isn't out of the realm of possibility for them. Even if they do kill your termagants, the Tervagon itself isn't really pulling its weight. It doesn't have the strongest attack profile, and while it can be difficult to kill, it's not invincible to anti-tank firepower. So, especially in a horde mode army where you're trying to overwhelm your opponent's attack volume by giving them many bodies that their anti-tank weapons are bad against, also deploying a Tervagon with your termagants basically gives them something to shoot at with those high damage weapons. You can keep the Tervagon pretty far back, but then you're putting a ton of points into a unit that's not really contributing to the fight beyond its ability to respawn models. If we do Termagant spam become an archetype that's useful in the future, I do think we'll probably see the stock of the Tervagon rise, but right now, I'm not quite seeing it. Now, speaking of cheaper points value, there's another guy who I think needs one is the Screamer Killer. This is the new update of the Screamer Killer Carnifex from the Leviathan set, and I don't love these guys. They're big, they're slow, and while they do have a 2+ save, they don't have many wounds, and their attack profile, while good, isn't quite as exciting as I think it needs to be to justify their inclusion. Again, just like we talked about with the Toxicrin, this guy pales in the comparison with similar options elsewhere in the Codex, and I think you're just really not that interested in bringing him. He does have a ranged attack, which gives him some interesting utility, but at the end of the day, isn't that exciting. Moving on, we have my very favorite boy, Harry Dan. He's making this tier list, moving up to the top of the not great category, if only for the fact that you bring an enormous and expensive aircraft to the table that's difficult to move around the table because of its physical mass, and also has OC0, so it doesn't actually complete your objectives. Big, huge single centerpiece units in 10th edition 40k are a little bit tough to use, especially given the lethality of the game currently from the top factions and things like the Towering keyword being able to see through obscuring terrain and pick off large enemy units before they're able to operate. All that wrapped up into a package of a unit that doesn't hold objectives and has a tough time completing secondary missions. Those are the reasons that Harry Dan isn't higher on my list. That said, especially compared to the Hierophant Biotitan, the Harridan's output is nuts. It has 2 dire biocannons and retained its frenzied metabolism ability, able to give them +1 to wound, an effect that we do not see that often anymore in 10th edition. At AP 3 and 3 damage, this guy can rip tanks off the table and put the hurt on other super heavies. It's just that scenario control that he's missing. Moving on, we have Tyrant Guard, and this might be a little bit of a controversial take, but I do not think these guys are useful. They are a leader unit, either for Neuro Tyrants or for Hive Tyrants, and in any case, basically reduce the survivability of their attached units, and make those units very difficult to play correctly. Both of those models want to be hiding somewhere around the center of your deployment zone, projecting their auras to your army. However, the real estate that you often have to actually place those models is usually pretty limited, because you don't want any enemies to get line of sight to them and remove those powerful support pieces before they do their thing. Tyrant Guard dramatically increase the volume of your unit by putting a bunch of 50mm based idiots next to your important HQ characters. And while they do have an appreciable melee output, it's not really worth justifying their include by itself. Not to mention the fact that all of the characters they attach to are monsters, meaning that you have both the infantry and monster keyword, getting the detriments of both, but the benefits of neither. You are affected by both anti-infantry and anti-monster weapons. You use a toughness of 8 rather than, if attached to the Hive Tyrant, the toughness of 10 that the Hive Tyrant would normally have. And on top of that, the Hive Tyrant doesn't actually gain the infantry keyword, so it still can't breach through ruin terrain. So while the Tyrant Guard and the unit themselves can move through walls, because the ruin breaching rules specify the keywords of each individual model in the unit, not the entire unit itself, the Hive Tyrant or Neuro Tyrant they're attached to still has to move around the walls anyway, so it's just difficult and convoluted to operate. Next up, we have the Scythe Tyranid, and I think this guy's only really here because of the comparison with the Barb Tyranid, which is much better. The Scythe Tyranid is a pretty good melee beat stick, it's relatively fast, and it's difficult to kill, and it has a pretty good flamethrower. But a good flamethrower isn't necessarily what we need in Tyranids, and there are good examples of that weapon elsewhere. A fast melee beater is good to have, but on a huge base that's difficult to maneuver around terrain and get charges with, especially with the new charge rules, making charges that much more awkward, this guy's gonna get in your own way more often than not. And I think that taking the Barb Tyranid instead for a very similar points value and giving yourself more options to fire at range rather than requiring you to be in melee is gonna be a much better use of your 300 points. Moving on to the mediocre tier. These guys are probably fine. They fit into a lot of lists, and if you like them, I certainly think you can make them work pretty effectively without too much effort. But I wouldn't put them in all of my lists, and I would have to sort of construct some synergies around them in order to justify their inclusion. The first one we have is the Moloch. This guy unfortunately pales in the comparison to the Trigon. He does have a cool orbital bombardment effect when he deep strikes in, but because he can still be screened by enemies, the actual portion of the table that you affect with that pulse of mortal wounds is not that effective. Because you still have to be 9 inches away from enemies when you deep strike, there's basically a 3-inch band between the 9-inch denial zone that they have and your 12-inch orbital bombardment zone that you damage when the Moloch comes into play. So it's still going to be far away from the enemies and only affect 1 or 2 units for a little bit of damage when it comes in. Compared to the Trigon as well, this guy is very sad. So if you are deciding which one to build your kit into, right now, the Trigon is much more effective. The Winged Hive Tyrant has all of the drawbacks of being a big, huge Hive Tyrant, but none of the benefits. He's easier to kill than the Foot Hive Tyrant, can't attach to Tyrant Guard even if you would want to, and while he does have Paroxysm as a psychic power, you're most likely gonna want to take the Onslaught psychic power on the Foot Hive Tyrant anyway, since it makes Tyranid guns that much more effective and makes it easier for you to score your secondaries. I don't think this guy's bad, especially because he has a little bit more melee output than the Foot Hive Tyrant. It's just difficult to justify his inclusion, given how difficult it is to move and hide this model without him being able to move over terrain with the new fly through the air rules. He can use the fly through the air rules to move, but most ruins are too large for him to actually physically get over, so he's functionally just a ground unit now. Being slower and easier to kill and not hitting as hard means that he definitely isn't as powerful as the Winged Hive Tyrants of the past, and I would almost 100% take a Foot Hive Tyrant instead. Moving on, we have the Psychophage. This is another new introduction from Leviathan and has an interesting Feel No Pain aura. While its actual attacks are basically worthless, and I wouldn't really be bringing this guy to actually do any damage unless you are playing in a ridiculously psychic heavy metagame, I do think that the Psychophage is interesting at the very least for broadcasting that aura. He can affect large numbers of monsters with it, or you can do the classic chaining of infantry squads back to the Psychophage to get that 6+ Feel No Pain. Now, interestingly, it doesn't do anything when stacked with Rapid Regeneration, which is a stratagem in Tyranids you're probably going to use 1 to 2 times every round. So oftentimes you'll find that his effect is kind of redundant with that. But if you're bringing more units than you can reasonably rapidly regenerate, a passive Psychophage just making your guys tougher to kill sitting in the back isn't too bad. He's cheap enough and hard to kill enough that your opponent is probably not going to attack him until the late game, so I imagine this guy will actually survive for a while, just given the fact that he's not actually that useful outside of buffing scarier units that your opponent's more incentivized to shoot at anyway. Kind of a mixed bag on this guy, honestly, but I do think in some archetypes he can work. Next up, we have the Swarmlord, and I actually did a video on the Swarmlord a couple weeks ago. I will link that up in the video up here somewhere, so you can hear my thoughts about the datasheet in a little bit longer format. The Swarmlord is basically the definition of mediocrity, which is why he's right in the middle of the tier list here. He is super expensive, provides extra command points, which is a benefit that Tyranids don't necessarily even need. He's less effective at buffing his army than a Hive Tyrant is, and while his Vect CP tax effect is very good, it doesn't make up for the fact that he is a slow, not very resilient melee-only beatstick who costs exorbitant points to include in your army. Honestly, just take a regular Tyrant and then replace all of the points you were going to spend on the Swarmlord with a bunch of other stuff to shoot guns and eat people with, and I think you'll be much happier. Moving on, we have the Broodlord and the Genestealers. I'm probably gonna sort of judge these guys together because largely they're gonna be in the same boat. I do think that Genestealers without a Broodlord are honestly probably more effective than with the Broodlord, because the Broodlord ends up dramatically increasing the cost of the Genestealer unit. He does give them devastating wounds so they can punch through armor pretty well, but given that they're already rerolling their wound rolls, you don't necessarily need it, especially when they are targeting their favored prey, which is small units that your opponent is putting onto objectives by themselves. While Genestealers and the Broodlord together have some of the highest average damage output into armor in the entire Tyranid Codex in melee, they're actually one of the few actually lethal melee threats that Tyranids have. They pay out the nose for that privilege, and you're probably running 300 points for that whole unit, which is going to be more expensive than most of the things you're punching. punching. But again, if you really want to have the melee counter punch, I think the whole combo is potentially worth considering. That said, individual units of Gene Stealers I think are a little bit better, which is why I put Gene Stealers one step ahead here. You can take units of 5 of them, they scout move, they can do actions for you, and if your opponent puts a couple Space Marines on an objective, those guys will rinse those dudes off very quickly. Next up, we have the Parasite of Mortrex. I don't have much else to say about this guy, besides the fact that a very fast infantry lone operative character is pretty good. That's a solid include to have. He's good at disrupting opponents' ability to hold objectives. He's solid at disrupting objectives in the late game, and you can put Synaptic Linchpin on him to have a very safe Synapse aura that you can maneuver around the table wherever you need to. Next up, we have the Carnifexes and Old One Eye. And again, just like the Gene Stealers and Broodlord, I'm going to be sticking these two things together because I think even more so than the Broodlord and Gene Stealers, these guys need to be played as a unit. I think part of the big downside of Old One Eye right now is that he doesn't really benefit from his own special abilities besides being kind of hard to kill if he's not leading a unit of Carnifexes. So the entire combo usually costs you somewhere in the 400 point range because you mostly want 2 Carnifexes to attach Old One Eye into. He unfortunately by himself is not survivable enough to stand around on the table with only a single Carnifex because he gets so much less effective when he loses that one Carnifex. You basically want to have the resilience to lose one Carnifex to a shooting attack, trigger their reactive move, and then get into melee in the next turn and have Old One Eye rip things apart. And if you can do that, these guys can do incredible work. Blowing up Knights and big super heavies and Titans and things like that is not outside the realm of possibility for these Carnifexes, which is good because of that hefty price tag. It just requires a lot of forethought because just like we've spoken about before with some of the other melee monsters in the faction, they are expensive and relatively slow, difficult to deliver monsters, and the Carnifexes themselves really kind of require Old One Eye to be in the unit because their weapon skill and ballistic skill characteristics are not good enough to be supported otherwise. Once they get in, it's absolutely glorious. The amount of carnage that Old One Eye and Carnifexes can inflict on your opponent's army is great. I think the best use case for these guys is rapid ingressing them in off of strategic reserve into a position where your opponent can only shoot them with 1 or 2 things, so that if they are tempted to fire at your Carnifexes, they will get closer to your opponent. But it does require a very specific situation to arise in order for that to be useful, and you have to be in a matchup where, again, a big beat stick unit like that is usable. Moving on, we have Raveners, and I think these are probably the most underrated unit in the index so far. They're relatively cheap, extremely fast infantry so they can breach through walls, they can deep strike to perform actions, they have a ranged attack and an incredible melee profile with 7 twin linked attacks apiece, and they have the ability to pick up into deep strike at the end of your opponent's turn. This can be used to deep strike them in the first round. If you're going second, after your opponent's first turn, you put them into reserve, and then immediately in your reinforcement step, they come back in and can perform actions. This makes them a hybrid counterpunch or utility unit. They're good at beating up especially light to medium infantry just with mass numbers of rerolling attacks, or they're also good at performing secondaries, being fast. I think that a unit of between 3 and 6 Raveners is not amiss in a lot of Tyranid armies. And with that, we move on to the staple data sheets. These guys are going to be found in a lot of Tyranid armies, and they're really the support backbone of a lot of Tyranid builds. Starting with the Death Leaper, and this might be another bit of a hot take, but the Death Leaper is usually the first lictor that's included in a Tyranid army, but I actually don't rate her that much. Because of the character keyword and the way the character operates, you will oftentimes be encouraged to put the Death Leaper forward and put her in harm's way. And if you do so, you risk giving up assassination to your opponent, and if your opponent has any abilities that trigger off destroying your characters or your warlord, that gets even worse for you. So you would be playing a lictor that you then try to keep safe and deploy very defensively, in which case you might as well just have a normal lictor anyway. Statistically, she is much better than a normal lictor, but it is that character keyword I think that's keeping her a little bit down. Moving on to the Barbed Hierodule. This guy is a ranged powerhouse with 2 D6 plus 6 shot blast weapons and strength 9 AP 2 damage, which doesn't sound like the greatest profile, except that the volume of fire that it spits out alongside getting Tyranid detachment abilities, so potential sustained hits against infantry or lethal hits against armor, makes up for that kind of middling profile. And unless your opponent has damage reduction, this guy's going to be chunking damage out of even heavily armored vehicles very consistently, especially since it also benefits from all of the internal Tyranid synergies when it comes to ranged attacks later later on in these top 2 tiers here. The Barb Tyranid packs that up with a good melee for late game, fast speed, and an incredibly strong defensive profile. This thing is really the complete package, and especially since other Knights and Super Heavies have been up-costed, but the Hyrule itself not really technically being a Super Heavy and just being a big monster has not, it's definitely more favorable in the comparison. I don't think you take them in every game, and I think they are living in the shadow of some of the other monsters that we'll talk about later in these tiers, but I do think that they are an incredible include, especially if you need long-range firepower in your army. And speaking of that long-range firepower, we have a pretty flexible profile here in the Tyranofex. Now, generally speaking, I think the Tyranofex is there to be a living tank. These guys have a 2+ save, high toughness value, and damage reduction, which is a combination of effects that not many tanks in the game have anymore. These things are functionally impossible to kill from a single shooting activation, and in some cases, even a single shooting phase. And that's really the use case, in my opinion. You want these guys to be moving up into the front of the table and forcing your opponent to kill them, thereby drawing fire from your more important units. Taking Flesh Borer Hives or Acid Sprays, I think, is the way to go, because then they can burn away opposing enemy units off of forward objectives, and they can just make your opponent's life a living nightmare when it comes to fighting Tyranids in a head-on battle. Even if they're trying to get around the sides, the Overwatch from an Acid Spray Tyranofex is disgusting, and because it's a monster, it can even Overwatch out of melee if it's engaged, as long as it has line of sight to the target. That makes it super difficult to avoid, so your opponent's small utility units have to cower in fear from the unstoppable might of a multi-damage auto-hitting torrent. And that moves us on to the Haruspex. Now we're getting into some melee monsters that are actually worth their point, and largely because the Haruspex is basically free. These guys are super cheap for what you get, which is a boatload of melee attacks, including some big, punchy, multi-damage attacks, and a high volume of AP1/2 damage attacks from their little tiny claws. These guys can make all of their attacks together, and once benefited by the Tyranid detachment abilities, can put ridiculous damage on basically whatever they get into contact with. The difficulty is actually getting to contact with them, but similar to the Tyranofex, I found that most often the Haruspex is dangerous enough that your opponent has to focus fire on it, meaning that your more important monsters will survive that much longer. And this guy's not easy to kill. He's high wounds count, high toughness value, that your opponent's not really going to be able to kill them efficiently. Haruspexes are great. They're really terrifying include. They're good on strategic reserve if you are rapid ingressing them, and they're just a big scary thing to set on objectives. Overall, pretty good, and for a very low points cost. Moving on, we have Von Ryan's Leapers. These guys are mostly just a solid utility unit. They have Infiltrators, which is a good ability to have, and they have Stealth, which makes them a little bit more defensive against ranged attacks. The problem for them is I think that they get overshadowed by Lictors, which we'll talk about later, because both of them have an Always Strikes First. Both of them having an Always Strikes First effect, Stealth and Infiltrator, and the Lictor having, generally speaking, higher quality attacks and lone operative. But the Von Ryan's Leapers aren't too bad by themselves. Having a 3-model unit rather than a single model means that they're better at screening, and having more attacks means they're better at fighting light T3 5 or 10 model units that are trying to complete your opponent's objectives. Now, speaking of T3 10 model units, Hormagaunts are the next one on the list, and I actually think all the Tyranid battle line infantry is super solid in this edition. Hormagaunts are one of them. They're move 10, they can advance and charge, and they have a bad melee profile, but still respectable for their low points value. 3 attacks apiece is okay, and while I wouldn't expect them to do any damage in melee, I do think that their potential damage is overrepresented sometimes. They are useful simply for their ability to swarm enemy objectives and prevent them from scoring. They're OC2, incredibly fast, and they can charge basically whatever they want, assuming that that thing doesn't overwatch or kill them on the swing back, and almost be assured that they are preventing your opponent from scoring. With their additional consolidation moves as well, they're very good at moving in, tagging enemy ranged units, and just generally being an absolute nuisance. Hormagaunts are pretty solid. I do think that they are maybe the weakest of the battle line infantry, but I think all the battle line infantry is generally playable, and if I have a couple extra points to turn Termagants into Hormagaunts, I generally will do so. Moving on, we have another new character from the Leviathan box set, the Neuro Tyrant. These guys pack a bunch of really cool support effects. They can put multiple units in Synapse for a full round, meaning that you can use your stratagems on them as if they were in Synapse range, and they're functionally immune to Battle Shock, and the timing of those abilities is very important. Since you can put important units in Synapse at the start of your command phase before you go to your Battle Shock step, so if you have Battle Shock checks that you really want to make, the Neuro Tyrant can ensure that you pass them. In addition, they have a sweet flamethrower, and they improve your Shadow in the Warp effect, which it needs all the help it can get, so that's pretty solid. And while Neuro Tyrants are less auto-include than I expected them to be, I do think that they are a useful include, especially for armies that are taking lots of light infantry and forcing them up the table as fast as they can go. Those units will oftentimes be leaving synapse auras, and the ability of the Neurotyrant to keep them in synapse for that full battle round until the start of your next turn is super useful for using reactive stratagems on them. Now moving on, might be a little bit of a surprise include here. It is the Trigon. These guys are super expensive melee monsters, which are archetypes of units that I have decried heavily already in this video, but their ability to deep strike 3 inches away from enemies is absolutely crucial. Inceptors are one of the best units in Warhammer 40k. I don't think it's a particularly controversial statement, and while Trigons are significantly worse than Inceptors, an Inceptor by any other name would still deep strike within 3 inches of your opponent's objectives. These guys are terrifying on the rapid ingress. Outside of Omni-Scrambler effects like Space Marine Infiltrators or the Genestealer called Clamavus, they're effectively impossible to screen. That means you can put them in a position where your opponent's anti-tank can't shoot them effectively at the end of their movement phase. You're then free to use their own 10-inch movement to get them in charge range, blow up enemy units, take their backline, steal their objectives, and just generally ruin their day. Moving on is a much simpler unit, however, the Venomthropes. These guys, for just a couple points, give you an aura of stealth on your light infantry and cover on everything light and heavy infantry. While cover is very easy to obtain in 10th edition 40k, stealth is very much not so. And these guys being able to buff your small units like your battle line infantry, your termagant units, and even your hardier, more important combat units like Zoanthropes with a -1 to hit effect is incredibly useful. Not to mention the fact that just including units in your army in 10th edition is generally good for things like actions and for screening, and Venomthropes, while not the cheapest unit in the army, are relatively inexpensive. So worst case scenario, you're going to be bringing a backline unit that has some good anti-infantry attacks, has some passive defensive auras, and in the best case scenario, they're going to make your army incredibly difficult to interact with for a low ballistic skill enemy. I love these guys. I rarely leave home without them, especially if I'm running an infantry-heavy army. If I don't need them, they're my backline objective sitters, and if I do, they can potentially win the game. Now, speaking of backline objective sitters, we have the perfect one here as the last entry in the staple category, Neurogons. These guys got a lot of flack for being just terrible. Their stats are so bad. But fortunately, the one stat that matters is very good, and that's their points cost. For 45 points, you get 11 models, which is maybe one of the best points per model conversions in the entire game. And that's pretty solid. There's not much else to say about them. They're dudes that they can spread your synapse aura, which is solid, and they hold objectives and can do actions and stuff and screen. And for 45 points, what more do you want? That moves us on to the hard carry category. Now, these guys are going to find play in most competitive Tyranid armies, and while the staple category includes a lot of the support that makes your army tick, these guys compose the army that is then being ticked. And this is starting with the Barbgons. Now, similar to the Neurogons, the best stat on these guys' card is their points value. And technically, it's in the Munitorum Field Manual. I understand that. It's not on their card, but if you assume that they are a single entity, that's the best thing about them. 10 points a model gets you a 2-wound toughness 4 guy, which is pretty solid. He's like a baby space marine who also happens to have like a frag rocket launcher on his back that's also a disruption effect. You can slow down enemy infantry units in matchups where your opponent is trying to aggress you with melee or slow infantry. Things like Space Marine Terminators or Custodian Guard absolutely hate to see these guys across the table. And while they're not useful in every matchup, just like we talked about with Venomthropes, having a unit of 5 dudes for 50 points is never bad. That's always a pretty good point per model conversion for a unit that's not the easiest thing to kill. In the best case scenario, however, they stop your opponent from completing crucial charges or just kill entire swaths of infantry, and that is definitely worth that 50-point price tag. Moving on to the next one, we have Termagants. These guys are just generically good light infantry. They are cheap per model. They have an assault weapon, which allows them to advance and perform actions if you draw those tactical objectives, and with a reactive move, they can oftentimes keep themselves safe for longer than your opponent wants to, or if your opponent misaligns their movement phase, they can even move block enemies that are trying to get to grips with you. The utility of this unit is amazing, and there's not much else I can say there. The ability to advance and do actions is great. The ability to move when your opponent moves is also great, and at a cheap points cost with OC2, they're good for stealing objectives away. It's generally pretty sweet. Now, moving on to some heavier hitters, the Maleceptor is the next one, and I'll admit, I think I passed this guy over too easily when I first read the index. He is nuts. These big Brady boys project an aura of -1 to hit with attacks if you're within 6 inches of them. This requires that the enemy be within 6 6 inches of the Maliceptor, and also gives them -1 to wound if they are below half strength. This ability is incredible because Maliceptors are probably one of the tankiest units, especially for their points value, maybe in the game, but certainly in Tyranids. They have a baked-in 4+ invulnerable save, which means a lot of the high AP ignoring cover weapons that factions are drilling into right now in order to punch through high armor saves with cover have no effect on the Maliceptor. The fact that its base save characteristic is not that good is not a big deal because lots of opponents are going to be running las cannons with extra AP, desolation squads ignoring cover, seismic cannons with AP bonuses at the wazoo. The Maliceptor cares not for your high technology weapons. If you can't overwhelm its invulnerable save, you are not killing this guy. And at a high toughness value with rapid regeneration to back that up, and situationally -1 to be hit, these things do not go down quickly. While they don't do very much in melee, they're not nothing. They have a couple of attacks if they need to clear infantry, and every once in a while they blow up a tank by rolling a bunch of 6s, which is cool, but they also bring a pretty high volume blast weapon to the table as well. So they're also good at clearing out enemy infantry, putting a little bit of damage on enemy vehicles, or even just blowing up enemy heavy infantry like Terminators or Custodians. Maliceptors are nuts, and I think a lot of Tyranid armies would be behooved to take 1 or 2 of them in their army. Moving on, we have the Pyrovore. Now, one thing I talk about on the channel a lot, and while it's not super relevant in 10th edition as much as it was in 9th, is the Cyberwolf effect. This was because of the Cyberwolf unit in Space Wolves in 9th edition. These guys were a 15-point single model unit, and it made them one of the best units in the game. For 15 points, you could get a little guy who could go and run around, he could hold objectives, he could do actions, and he was super useful. And the Pyrovore is the Cyberwolf of Tyranids. For 30 points, you get a model with a big base. And that's already good. But on top of that, the Pyrovore is one of the most necessary support units that Tyranids have. They have a flamethrower that's twin-linked and D6+1 shots, already off to a great start, but it also removes cover from enemies that they hit with it, and that is super important for supporting a Tyranid gun line. All Tyranids want to do every day is max out their secondaries by passively generating spore mines and kill every single enemy model that stands in the middle of the table so that they can hold their primary objective points. And having 2 or 3 Pyrovores pointing their big weird looking guns directly at that middle area means that any enemy units that run in are essentially -1 save because everything gets cover in 10th edition. It's so easy to gain cover that ignoring cover basically gives your entire army +1 AP against them, and that for 30 points is such a good ability to have. I love these guys. I have at least 2 in all my armies and 3 when I can fit them. I just think they're super sweet. What else is super sweet is the Exocrine, and I have to apologize to the Exocrine because I did it dirty when the first index came out. We didn't have points values for these Tyranid models, and I said that the Exocrine was one of the least improved models in the faction, in fact, probably one of the most nerfed. The fact that their gun went from being high strength, high AP to being low to mid strength, mediocre AP, and a much more random shot profile absolutely soured me on the unit. But what I didn't anticipate was an absolute steal of a points value combined with the power of the Tyranid detachment ability. Giving them sustain or lethal hits, depending on what they're shooting at, means that their low strength doesn't matter so much against high toughness enemies. And it's almost basically +1 to wound mathematically in a lot of situations. So these guys are sort of, if you have given them lethal hits against monsters and vehicles, the equivalent of strength 11 or 12, which feels much better than the strength 8 that's actually printed on their card. And being a super high damage, decent AP blast weapon with potential sustained hits against infantry means that they clear heavy infantry more efficiently than almost anything else in the game. Not to mention the fact that their gun is heavy, so if they're able to post up and command a line of sight, they can clear out so many enemy infantry units or put significant damage on enemy vehicles, and your opponent doesn't even want to shoot them back because, like a lot of the other units we've talked about, they are cheap enough to be basically free in the Tyranid Codex. And if that wasn't enough, they also give you a reroll 1s to hit effect on whatever they shoot at, supporting the rest of your gun line. Exocrines are phenomenal. I did them dirty, and I have to apologize to my turtle boys. I'm so excited about them because I have 2 gorgeously painted Exocrines right on my shelf behind me here that I'm excited to drop on the table again in the not too distant future because these guys are so great. Moving on to the Lictor. These are the bread and butter of Tyranid secondary secondary missions beyond the spore mines that we've talked about before. They're infiltrators and lone operatives with stealth and fikes first. They're super difficult to engage with. You can use them to screen, you can use them to perform actions on the first turn by putting them near the middle of the table, and you can easily keep them safe from enemy ranged attacks, even if your opponent goes first, as long as they're not super fast or have strong deep strikers. Even if they're fast but only have melee attacks, the lictor's always going to get the first word in, and with precision weapons, if your opponent has a light to medium character inside their unit, it is almost assured that the lictor will kill them and generate you command points, which is sweet. They're just good in basically every situation, and in the worst case scenario, you can just put them on your back objective, forget about them for the entire game because they're unshootable back there, and unless your opponent's deep striking, they basically can't interact. Lictors are great. I basically take 2 of them in all my armies now, and I could definitely see myself taking 3 or even 4 with the inclusion of Death Leaper. And that moves us on to Gargoyles, the last of the Tyranid battle line infantry, and in my opinion, the most useful. Although certainly not the most spammable, because they are the most expensive at just about 7.5 points per model. They have an assault weapon just like the Termagants, however, they also back that up with being incredibly fast with a base movement speed of 12 and a fire and fade effect, allowing them to move after shooting. This means that this unit can advance up to 18 inches if you are lucky enough to roll a 6, shoot their guns, and move another 6 inches. And with an OC2 on the entire unit, they can easily steal objectives away from people when they were not expecting. Gargoyles are good at scoring, they're good at screening, they're good at blocking enemy movement, and they're ridiculously fast. They can also deep strike if you need them to. They basically have everything going for them. They're just easy to kill, but that's not too bad because they're battle line infantry. They're mostly there to die, and in the off chance they don't die, they are endless swarms, so you can bring them back with a stratagem. Next up, we have the backbone of the Tyranid command point economy, the Foot Hive Tyrant. Now, I've talked about the Swarm Lord and I've talked about the Winged Hive Tyrant in this video. They've all been some level of mediocre, but that is not the case for the Foot Hive Tyrant. He and the Winged Hive Tyrant both broadcast the same command point reduction effect. They get 1 free stratagem on both you and your opponent's turn for a potential value of up to 4 CP per turn in free stratagems. Robute Gilliman is as good at supporting his army as a single regular Tyranid Hive Tyrant. The reason that the Foot Hive Tyrant is so much more effective at this than the Winged Hive Tyrant is not only the fact that he is significantly smaller and harder to kill. Being a very small model when assembled in his foot variety means that the Foot Hive Tyrant is actually very easy to hide, so he can actually stand around the front of your deployment zone, broadcast his free stratagem auras, and support your army much more easily than the Winged Hive Tyrant can. On top of that, he also has higher base defensive stats. But not only that, he also grants ranged weapons on your models within 6 inches assault, and given that most Tyranid ranged weapons are relatively short range, things like zoanthropes, which we'll talk about later, as well as pyrovores and maleceptors, all have a low movement speed and relatively short range, means that the Foot Hive Tyrant allowing them to advance and perform actions or shoot their guns is super duper strong. Now, not only that, but he's also got appreciable melee, and while I wouldn't bring him as a melee threat by himself, I don't think he's good enough for that. They can certainly anchor your game plan effectively enough, especially if you equip them with both the Monstrous Bone Sword and Tyrant Talons. That gives them a total of 10 attacks, either with lethal or sustained hits, depending on what you're attacking and whether or not they have the correct keywords. And that all put together is good enough for them to finish off a lot of units that your army has started to deplete over the course of the game. Now that moves us on to the number 2 unit in the faction so far. These are the Zoanthropes. These guys are the core of Tyranid damage output. They are almost entirely offensively oriented. They do have a defensive aura that they do generate, so they can give a 6+ invulnerable save. This is especially good on large units of Termagants or Hormagaunts that have pretty poor saves to begin with, but can be buffed up to a 6+ invulnerable save, which makes them that much harder to kill. That isn't really why you're taking them though. You're taking them for their ranged attack, which is either a single D6 +1 damage laser beam or a D3 shot, strength 7 AP2 2 damage blast attack. Now this is a perfect profile because they do not ever have a bad matchup for their attacks outside of factions that have incredibly strong psychic defense. These things are incredible. The one downside is their slow speed and their lack of range. You can make up for that a little bit with the Tyrant, but generally speaking, you want to keep them relatively safe until your opponent moves things into the center of the table, and then when they do, a big unit of Zoanthropes pounces and blows them off the table. I absolutely love these guys. I think between 12 and 18 is very good for most Tyranid armies, unless you're spamming bodies, and even just a brick of 6 to problem solve some specific situations. You need to blow up a knight. You've got 6 last cannons sitting in the back that are relatively cheap and also broadcast a defensive aura, and they're not the easiest thing to kill in the swing back because of the number of wounds that they have, which is just so good. Now last, but certainly maybe least, it's the #1 unit in the faction in my opinion. It is the Biovore, simply because they generate spore mines. That's it. That's all they got going for them. Spore mines in this new edition have the ability to score objectives. They don't have an OC value, so they can't hold objectives to score primary, but they can be counted as being on the battlefield for doing things like getting engaged in all fronts, score behind enemy lines, perform actions like deploy teleport homers. They are ridiculously useful, and these guys are basically the sole reason that you'll find that Tyranid secondary mission control is as strong as it is. Not to mention the fact that spore mines are not actually that useful by themselves, and the Biovore gun is actually kind of okay. It is a heavy D3 shot blasting devastating wounds indirect fire gun, so when they stand still, they're able to hit on 4s. They can blast to a reasonable number of attacks, and if they roll any 6s, convert those into mortal wounds, and they're actually good for chipping and damage on even hard targets if you're willing to fish for 6s. That said, most of the time, if you pull a tactical objective that requires you to be in a particular place on the battlefield, you can usually put a spore mine there as long as it's not within 9 inches of enemies. And the timing of this is also important because it happens during your shooting phase. So even if your opponent is screening out the position where you would want to put the spore mine, you can kill their units first, then place the spore mine down, which is super useful. And with that, that is the entirety of the Tyranid Index power ranking. Let me know down in the comment section what you think about it and if you agree with my choices. All of these are based on personal experience and personal observation, so if you disagree, please let me know exactly why and how you think I could have changed things. Big thanks to Into the AM for sponsoring this video. I am enjoying their clothes. As you can see, actually my last couple of videos I've been wearing the shirts that they've given me and they're super comfy. So please go check them out at intotheam.com/tacticaltortoise. Big thanks to everybody who supports the channel as well, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise, YouTube channel members and Twitch subscribers. All you people are great and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.